So I'm a physical therapist. I own probably the largest privately held physical therapy company in the United States for several decades. My wife was a hospital administrator and also is a physical therapist. We got together and we built 31 physical therapy offices in New York City and had more than 3,000 referring doctors to our practices for decades. And we trained, we were a training facility. We were involved with all the PT schools and doing affiliations for students. That's partly how we got our employees. And we got involved in vestibular rehab before the turn of the century. And if you look back, there were only about 100 therapists in the United States who were involved in any sort of vestibular rehab in those days, because it just wasn't taught in PT schools and people didn't understand how to do the diagnostics. The technology was just being invented. So we ended up training 450 physical therapists in vestibular rehabilitation and concussion management, and we got started with that, and I got involved with the newest technologies that were being invented, okay? And so, just changing the page here. Okay. So this is another one of our pictures. The battery of tests is called the VNG Plus, and the VNG Plus involves objective testing. So the newest technologies in those days were video nystagmography, posturography, and then eventually computerized neurocognitive testing. So the first of the tests, VNG, video nystagmography, the science of it is in 1974 to 1984, the scientists and researchers and the United States military were looking at shining infrared light on the human eye so that you could see what the eye does in the dark. The reason that's important is the brain can suppress reactions that are involuntary when there's ambient light. But in the dark, it can't do that, and the involuntary movements have some specific meanings, especially with regard to brain injury and dysfunction. So that's one of the technologies. VNG was started in those days, and it was developed, and then it became a public company on the NASDAQ. I got involved from the other end, from the rehab end, wanting to supply the referring physicians that we had with the diagnostics, and then doing the rehab. So I got so much involved with that public company, who was the inventor of this technology. I took over all their service and support. I created a better mousetrap for the way they did interpretations, because the way they did it was really 19th century. So we organized that for them, and we made it electronic, and we created a company called Interpra. And so Interpra was the interpretation service for physicians utilizing this technology. And we ended up taking over that public company. We took it off the NASDAQ. We're now private. I own the FDA 510K. I've been servicing and supplying hospitals and universities and practices throughout the United States. We're in all 50 states. We have thousands of customers. So not only do we supply them with that equipment, but we do their interpretations. So those interpretations that we've been doing for decades have mounted up to hundreds of thousands of these. That makes us the repository of all of the VNG interpretation and information, and everything nowadays is data driven. So we have all the data, and I'll talk about how that helped us create Medtrak Diagnostics. So that's VNG. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit here. Oh, this is a nice picture. I call this neural pathways. So we're going to get back to this in a second. So here's a picture of one of our technicians in our training center who has on the goggles and is laying on a table or looking at a computer, and you can see the graphs that a VNG makes. Okay, and this would be what the person sees on the computer. You can see the eye. Everybody see the white centric and the crosshairs? So if you don't, just shake your head, but I assume you'll see that. Okay, so what we're doing is we're locking on the darkest part of the eye, okay, which is the pupil, and we're monitoring any movement of any kind with the eye. So if I asked you all out there to move your eye 1 micron, you have no idea what I'm talking about, and obviously you can't do it. But we can measure that involuntary or voluntary movement. It is very important to be able to measure what the eye does, especially in the dark. This is a picture of tracking. This is an oculomotor test. You can see in the right corner that there's a perfect sine wave in the dark color, and in the red is what the eye is doing. It's not perfect, and there are fibrillations in the eye. So the tracking, this is recorded, and these recordings are very specific, and they are interpreted. And we actually wrote the only textbook that exists in the world on interpretation for this technology. So, and we've trained thousands of doctors in this. So this is an abnormal tracking test. You can see that there's an overshoot by the eye. It goes too far. On a VNG, anything above the x-axis. So if you look at, you see there's a y and an x-axis. Anything above the x-axis is movement to the right. Anything that would go below or toward the going below is to the left. So here the patient overshoots. Their eye moves too far to the right when the icon that they watch. Okay, did I show what? See, in this picture, I went back so you can see the icon. Okay, on the left picture where the eye is, you can see the little hourglass. So that would be movement to the right. This would be up top. Their movement to the right, they overshoot. And overshooting is an oculomotor dysfunction, and it is very meaningful because it has to do with foveation, which we'll also talk about later. So there's lots of different tests. This is the vestibulocular reflex. You can see it's very complicated. All it though it means is really simply, if I were to put my hand in front, my finger in front of my face, and I turn my head to the right, and I am continuing to look at the object, okay, what you're doing is you're getting movement in one direction and the other. The head is moving one way, so you see on the graph, and the eye is moving exactly 180 degrees in the opposite direction. People who have traumatic brain injuries, this vestibulocular reflex is often disabled. And so you won't get this perfect graph that you see here. So you can see this all goes by recordings. We're recording what the eye does, what the head does, and you cannot fake a VNG. It is not possible because you can see on this particular graph, it repeats over and over and over. If I asked you to move to the right in 0.97 seconds with your eye, and then move to the left in 0.97 seconds and repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it, you couldn't possibly fake that. It's just, and this is peer-reviewed, Daubert, unchallengeable anymore. It's just accepted technology. It's been peer-reviewed to the nth degree for 50 years. So the predecessor to VNG was ENG, where we used electrodes and not an infrared camera. So that's the science of VNG. I'm going to go back a little bit. We're now on the next technology, and this is posturography. So you can see the person standing with a therapist on a force plate. If you look carefully, you may recognize that it looks like the Wii board that your kids play with. This is the second prototype. The original prototype, I own the trademark for it. It was created by Ohio State University for the National Aeronautics and Space Agency because astronauts have a great deal of trouble with their equilibrium when they come back from space. So Ohio State created the original prototype. We now don't use Ohio State anymore. We manufacture it ourselves. And we actually have a deal with Nintendo, who makes the best force plate that exists in the world. The sensors are so good that we decided not to make them ourselves, but make a deal with them. We ripped the faceplate off, put our own software in. So you can see the patient is looking at the screen, and I'm going to show you what the graphs look like for posturography. So here's one of my technicians standing on a force plate with a perturbed surface. Notice there's a blue surface over the stable surface, and that takes away her proprioception. So this graph, the picture that you're looking at, there are normal blue bars. So we give you the age-matched normative data. So this is all age-matched. We spent decades creating the appropriate age-matched information. Ohio State worked on that. A company called Neurocom worked on that. I assisted them. We did our own research. So these are standard in the industry now. So you can see what the norms are, and the red bars, those are dysfunctional bars. That's what the patient is able to exhibit. So what you're looking for is a patient in one of the tests, okay, called your limits of stability, okay, or your modified clinical test of sensory integration of balance. That's MCTSIB. You're looking for either the patient to be stable or the patient to be able to move around their center of gravity. So you can see a dot right here at the XY axis. That's what the test should look like. When we go back, that's this first set of bars looking at your ability to do this on a stable surface, eyes open, and your vestibular system working. There's 3 systems that keep you upright in space. Your visual cortex, your visual system, your proprioceptive ability through your feeling in your feet, muscles, joints, etc., sensory motor, and your vestibular system, which is your inner ear mechanism. So in your inner ears, there's semicircular canals and a whole organ and mechanism, and you have 2 of them, one on each side, that help you with balance and equilibrium. So a normal person standing with all 3 systems working should be able to make just that one dot. Okay? Here's what it looks like in 4 pieces. The top left is all 3 systems working. The top right, we take away the eyes visual system by closing your eyes. So you see this person has a little more trouble than in the top left when we take away one system. Then we open up the eyes but put that perturbed surface, that's the bottom right, bottom left, okay, graph. And now they start to sway over to the right quadrant. But on the last graph, we take away proprioception and vision, and all of a sudden this patient cannot handle balance at all because their vestibular system is not working properly. So this would be a patient who has a vestibular injury, okay, or vestibular dysfunction if they have a disease process, but we correlate all the information, so we'll talk about that later. Here's the newest graphs that we make that look like these. Okay, that's posturography. The last test that we do in the VNG Plus battery of tests is called computerized neurocognitive test. So I had a nicer picture of what it looks like. There we go. So this is called a digital symbol test. The partnership that I created with Baylor Medical School and Texas Medical Center is this. Baylor Medical School worked on concussions for about 20 years. They have an Eagleman Laboratories, and David Eagleman is in charge of that. Nice guy, real good neuroscientist, just exceptional person who really muddled through creating this in a web-based platform. If you think about starting this 20 plus years ago, that was ahead of its time. But now with iPads, you're able to do a computerized neurocognitive test, which utilizes all of the standard tests in the industry. So this is what you're looking at is a digital symbol test. You have a symbol, you have numbers, you have a connection, and the person has to pick correctly, and the reaction times are monitored. Again, you can't fake this. You get a malingering pass or fail. The patient during this test will be able to find the symbol and the correct number in 0.67 seconds, 0.68 seconds, 0.64 seconds, 0.67 seconds. If you're a malingerer and you're trying to fake this, like what we did with the United States military, who we consult with for traumatic brain injury, you get 0.64, 0.97, 0.345, and it would be all over the place. And the computer will recognize the reaction times are that of someone trying to fake the test, and you can't pass. So the numerous tests that you see in the nomenclature are here. So you see immediate and delayed recall, the Stroop effect, digital symbol, which I just showed you, flanker, trail making. These are all tests that have been in neuropsychologist nomenclature and testing for years and years. The problem with that is they grade it. We don't want a person grading tests. If they have any prejudices, they're having a bad day, whatever you might come up with, or if the defense has somebody who's going to grade it on the other side to controvert what your expert says, they can say whatever they want. It's subjective. On a computerized test through Baylor Medical School and Texas Medical Center, the computer doesn't care. It has no prejudices. So this is the wave of the future. I know PI law firms utilize the neuropsych people as one of the tools in traumatic brain injury, but once you start to use these tests, you'll move away from spending all that money. In the same way that you should probably move away from using MRIs One of the problems with resolution for magnetic resonance imaging and imaging in general, not talking about DTI, but general imaging, is that it measures major structures and does not look at metabolic or microscopic injuries. And a mild traumatic brain injury is just that. It's metabolic. You have injury to the cells, to the neurons, to the dendrites. An MRI doesn't pick that up. If you do happen to have a mild or, a moderate or severe traumatic brain injury, then you're going to see bleeding and maybe fractures, and then it's certainly worth utilizing. But a lot of the law firms that we work with, and there's hundreds of them, used to say, well, we got nothing to lose. But that's not exactly true, because I've seen MRIs show that the person has some sort of a cancer. And so if you have some sort of tumor in your brain and you're trying to show the MRI that this is a traumatic brain injury, you've now run yourself into trouble. So if you can't really look, and the other thing is 90% of your brain injuries that you're dealing with, especially in motor vehicle collisions, are mild traumatic brain injuries. And I didn't make that up. I think that comes straight out of the National Institute of Health. They say more than 90% of the traumatic brain injuries are mild. Okay, so once again, what we're looking at here is neurocognitive testing, okay, in a computerized setting. The person utilizes an iPad, and they only need 10 to 12 minutes to perform the test. That's another very important point. Your neuropsych people, they do the test, and it takes an hour. In the military, it takes 6 to 7 hours. You can't get a brain injured patient to concentrate or have an attention span past 10, 15 minutes. So all the information you're getting at minute 30, 40, 50 is really quite spurious, okay, and has to be graded by a person. So that's the 3 objective tests that we do in the battery. There are a few other tests that we do that I don't call objective, because the testing person who is the technician who administers these tests, they have to make a determination, pass or fail. So one would be a Romberg test. If anyone out there is familiar with that, you stand with your feet close together, not touching. You put your hands across your chest, close your eyes, and we'll see if you lose your equilibrium. Okay, there's a proprioception type test, and also a measure of the vestibular system. But the person has to say pass or fail, and that's a person. So I call that somewhat subjective. Fukuda test, where you stand with your eyes closed and you march, high marching. When people have lost one of their vestibular inner ear mechanisms, left or right, the marching will end up being a screening test to show us that they're going to rotate toward the side that's been injured, or possibly, if both are injured, forward and back. Or we do a near point conversion test for blurred vision. And we also look for eye disconjugacy. That you're going to see with people who have blast injuries or who have been a blow to the head. And so one eye will stay in one position when they're supposed to move the same exactly both sides. When you go to move to the right, the other eye will float the other way. So we look for that, and that's a measure of traumatic brain injury. It's just another finding that we look for. But the battery of tests are the ones that I just showed you. Here's the digital symbol test once again, so you can see. This is on an iPad. Very simple, easy, web-based portal for the patient to use. Nothing complicated here. This matches to this, matches to 5. Hit the number. Okay. This is the type of report that you get. So Texas Medical Center, when they were trying to bring this to the medical community, they sought me out because we have the largest repository of information for the medical community for this part of the industry. So we helped them to create this 2-page narrative report, okay, and that is now provided with part of the long report that we provide for you. All right, so I'm just going to go back a little bit here. I want to show you in a test. We're right now involved in research with a major university on the East Coast. Dr. Newman and I started to notice 5 years ago when we started testing traumatic brain injured patients exclusively with Medtrak Diagnostics, a different company, as opposed to all of the general population that gets tested and runs across our desk, that we started to see something very unusual with brain injured patients. And if you're looking at this graph, you can see on the top there's a plateau, and it's exactly flat, straight line. So remember, above the x-axis is looking to the right. Okay, so when a person foveates, you've all seen the police officer go like this for a sobriety test, and you have to track. Okay, that's a tracking test. That's the one with the sign rate. But saccades is foveating in one position. So the object is here, and I look with my eyes. And then it disappears. My eyes are still to the right, and then it appears here. And I have to switch, not with my head, but with my eyes. So if you look at this graph, okay, it's movement to the right, staying to the right, staying to the right, and then a quick movement to the left. But this traumatic brain injured patient, when they foveate to the left, that line is not flat. We originally called it micronystagmus, but we now call that microsaccades. But they're high amplitude. So you see this as a biomarker on a VNG graph in a traumatic brain injured patient and not in the general population. In the general population, you would see that flat graph that you see up on the top and not that jagged graph that you see on the bottom. So the complaint that you often see with a patient is that they have difficulty reading, okay? Besides concentrating and attention, one of the main complaints is they can't read. The reason for that is that jagged edge that you're seeing when they're looking to the left is their eye fibrillating back and forth. So imagine trying to read something if your eye is doing this. You can't do it. So this is a permanent disability. This person is going to have trouble with this. It's going to cause headaches and dizziness and lightheadedness. And then it might go away, but it'll come back. And one of the things that you're going to hear from adjusters or doctors who really don't understand TBI or a therapist who hasn't treated a lot of these is they're going to think it's over, it's cured, it's gone. But now we'll go back to that beautiful picture that I started you off with. Okay, which is this one. So this is the brain, and these are the neural pathways, and this is how complicated it is. Now imagine me putting my hand in there and ripping out the middle section of that. Okay, that takes away the neural pathway. And once a neural pathway is gone, it's gone. And that's a permanent disability. So some people, it's memory. It depends on the lobe that's injured. Some people, it's word finding. All different types, and we're going to get into what the different 39 subjective complaints are. But neuroplasticity, the theory that we could bring back all these pathways, I'm doing this in 5 decades, rolled up my sleeves for decades treating patients, and that's just not the case. You are going to get vestibular decline. So the way that we do rehab for patients who have brain injury is called compensation and coping techniques. If you have the left, your left inner ear mechanism is out, you have one on the right. The therapist will train the patient to use that vestibular system on the right. The problem is, that's great if you're 40. What happens when you get to 60? Now this mechanism is starting to deteriorate and you don't have the other. And so you end up with a decline and a downgrade in your lifestyle, and it's going to be in the future. The other thing that the literature is now showing, this is not Scott, Medtrak, my consultants, it's peer-reviewed literature, and we've posted it on our website, is that even one concussion, okay, one, makes you much more likely, high prevalence of getting dementia, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinsonism, other motor problems, and your balance and coordination is going to decline, okay? With a reasonable degree of medical probability and certainty, and off the record, not in a deposition, I guarantee you, okay? That's just between us, I don't say that in a deposition, but I guarantee you, having been a clinician doing this and teaching people all over the country, because we do run a CEU training course, which we've done for decades, that these people will decline. They will have vestibular decline. They're going to fall and be full risk patients. They're going to have other injuries. And if you don't compensate them now and they can't continue to get treatment, then they will surely have that sooner. So we want to keep them as functional as possible, and we recommend that the patients have rehab for life, and that comes in a future rehabilitation care cost report, like a life care plan at the end of our report, indicating the exact dollar amount that we expect it to cost for rehab. It doesn't include psychiatry or future injuries or medical care or pharmaceuticals, just for rehab. And I will tell you in our reports, the average is for a 20-year-old, $3 million, 40-year-old, $2 million, 60-year-old, $1 million worth of future rehab. So all your policies out there that are 100,000, 250, 500, you send in a demand letter, you should get full policy limit, because these people are going to need expensive rehab for the rest of their lives. Realize this too, this is 2020. The physical therapy costs $400 a session. I can't guarantee you it'll be $400 in 2030. It might be 600, it might be 800, I don't know. So it will be more expensive, I guarantee you that, because since I started this in 1986, I've seen nothing but it get more expensive. I've never seen it get to be cheaper. All right, so that's neuroplasticity. Coup contra coup, this is a nice picture that we borrowed. It's just a mechanism of injury, and that's going to get us to the brain injury checklist. So coup contra coup kind of means this. You have a movement forward and back, okay, or rotational, and the brain bounces off the inside of the skull, which is very hard, and the brain doesn't like to be bounced off of anything, and it gets injured easily. So in a motor vehicle collision, okay, the latest research is 9 miles an hour, but I write what my engineers have told me over the years and years. Anything over 17 miles an hour, the human head weighs more than 10 pounds, the human cervical musculature cannot hold you, and your head will move in a whiplash manner, whether it's linear or rotational or both. Linear movement, 98 newtons of force, rotational, 5,966 radians per second. What you get is tearing in the sheaths and bouncing intracranially of the brain off the skull. This creates injury and damage to the neural pathways. That is a permanent disability, and you're going to find all kinds of symptoms because of that. And I will tell you that I've seen that the rotational shearing tends to be worse than just a straight linear. But think about a car collision. How often is a car collision perfect linear movement, either straight side to side or straight forward and back? There's always a rotational component to it, or almost always. I mean, unless you're in a laboratory or doing a test. There's a beautiful test online, if you Google it, 9 mile an hour car collision, where you see this violent motion of the head at 9 miles an hour. And you know that patient has a brain injury. Okay, so we made this beautiful checklist, which we mailed to the case managers so they can vet the cases. Oh, there we go, I went too far. It's in the beginning. Okay, so it looks like this. This is the full sheet. I actually have one here in front of me. So it's a real thing, it exists. Okay, and so next picture, mechanism of injury. So we show here, first of all, in the top right, the battery of tests. It tells you what VNG Plus is, video nystagmography, brain check neurocognitive, full track, and special balance and special testing. But now if you look in step 1, mechanism of injury. We're not dealing with brain injuries with someone who dropped a hammer on their toe. Okay, there's something that affected the brain. A motor vehicle collision, very common, again, over 17 miles an hour. It is almost assured that you're going to have a brain injury. There might not be a lot of car vehicle damage, but the violent movement of the head is like shaking a baby violently, and you're going to injure the brain. There does not have to be any contact to the head to have a concussion, which is a mild traumatic brain injury, same word. Okay. But obviously, if you have a blow to the head, if someone hits you with a baseball bat, if you bang your head against the window, you're likely to injure the brain. But there are also other types of brain injuries, okay? Blasts, like the service people go through overseas in theater, and even oxygen deprivation or exposure to noxious chemicals. We just had a mother and daughter who lived above a meth lab, didn't know it was there in an apartment building, and they had terrible brain injuries from that. So These are potentials, but I would say probably the majority of the cases that we see in the 9 states we're in right now are motor vehicle collisions. Loss of consciousness. If you have a loss of consciousness and it's documented, you've had a brain injury, period, nothing to talk about. Okay, they're candidates for this test. This sheet is for we made this for the case managers to vet cases so that if they're talking to a client, they can kind of get an idea of whether or not there's a brain injury and they should send them for the test. So loss of consciousness, automatically send them. Need a mechanism of injury, and then you're going to get a presentation from a patient. That presentation is going to be that either they don't feel right, or they're not feeling their usual self, or something's just not right. If you've ever spoken to a brain-injured patient, you get that feel from them. Now, not every brain-injured patient will offer all the symptoms. When I first started the research for this, in determining the possible subjective symptomatology, Johns Hopkins and Rivermead and UCLA said there were 15, but we have so much more data than them that we found that there were way more. There are actually 39. So we've condensed that into step 2, and step 2, you can see I separated it here by lobe, but realize that there's carryover. So if you look under cerebellum in the middle, it says balance problems. But a balance problem is not only your cerebellum. It could be the brainstem. It could be the peripheral vestibular system. I tried to get all 39 on one piece of paper. So remember, there's carryover. But as you ask a patient and you start checking off and they say yes, they may offer all the symptoms. Or some of the macho patients may not want to tell you what's wrong. But if you ask them, are you easily distracted? They'll admit to it. So as you check off more than 5 of these symptoms, you know you have a brain injury. And we, again, are data-based, data-driven, and we didn't just come up with 5 as a random number. 5 is the number. Once you get past that, we know you have brain injury. Okay, so the case managers typically use this. It's located on my website under the picture where it says the silent epidemic. So when you log on to my website, which is www.medtrakdx.com, and I'll do a little commercial here. Medtrak is spelled M-E-D-T-R-A-K. There's no C in the track. We take out the C for concussion. So that's an old, if you've ever remember the mattress commercial where you take off the S for saving, now you remember Medtrak has no C. So M-E-D-T-R-A-K, D-X for diagnostics, D like dog, X like X-ray. So medtrakdx.com, you will find this there. You can download it. We could send you a whole package of these if you want them, a box of them for your case managers. But you have it there to be able to print out. It's very nice to have on your desk if you're talking to or intaking a new client. But the essence of all of this is what you're looking at is a patient who has these symptoms, and you want to be able to correlate to the objective test these symptoms. That's very important. So I'll use an analogy that I typically use, would be in front of a jury. If you have fallen and you think you broke your arm, but we're in an age before X-ray, so there's no objective test to see if the arm is broken, if the bone is broken, you would say subjectively, it's weak, it's swollen, it's hurting me, I can't turn my arm or my hand, I'm having trouble, it feels like it's broken. One doctor could say, yeah, I agree, broken in the 1800s. Another might say, no, I don't think so, it's a sprain. But now you have the invention of an X-ray. So that's the objective test. So now you take the X-ray, see the picture of the broken radius, now all those subjective complaints match to the objective findings. So what we've done is we've spent 5.5 years with more than 1 trillion possible combinations and utilizing engineers and special computer people to figure out exactly what the correlation between every subjective complaint that you see on that sheet to every objective finding in the battery of tests. So now you'll get a report that says, here's the finding of the brain injury or dysfunction, and this is why those complaints are symptoms for the patient. And then again, realize that these symptoms are permanent. Although a patient may go through therapy and feel better and not be having any issue at all, it will come back. And that's the part that insurance carriers and defense and adjusters don't want to hear about. They want to say, oh, they had therapy, they're all better, that's it. And that's just not the case. And we've been doing this for 5 decades. We see the vestibular decline. One of the things I want you to all remember from this conversation is you think of the initials TBI as traumatic brain injury. But I want you to also remember that TBI should stand for traumatic balance injury. So I would say in the last 1,000 patients that we saw, all 1,000 patients had a balance component to their brain injury. And the reason for that is, again, I mentioned 3 systems that keep you upright in space: your visual system, your proprioceptive system, and your inner ear. And although the inner ear sometimes is injured, sometimes not, think about proprioception and how you feel where you are in space and what you feel through your feet and how you get older and don't feel as well, and through your feet or through your muscles or joints. Your vision, when you're 20, great. When you're 40, when you're 60, not so good. So these systems deteriorate, okay? And if there's a component to injury there, again, you're gonna have a lot of trouble and be a full risk. Okay, so now we're gonna continue on, okay? By the way, this is right and left beating nystagmus. In the word video nystagmography, so video, obviously, we're using a video, okay? And sometimes it's called infrared video nystagmography because we're using infrared light. So the nystagmus, this is a beating in your eye. There's a slow component and then a fast movement to the other side, okay? The fast movement is what we describe in terms of the beating. So it's left beating, what you see here, or right beating. That's the fast component. So you see a slope, that's the slow component, and then fast motion down. Remember, down is to the left on a VNG. So that's a left beating. That's what we see, okay, when we look in graphs of the VNG, okay? So this would be, okay, the same, what we're looking at, okay, in terms of nystagmus. That's how we interpret during, this is a caloric test, okay? Caloric tests, again, to give you an idea why a VNG can't be faked, we supply either hot or cold air or water into the ear canal. That reaches the tympanic membrane, which is your eardrum, and it changes the temperature across the membrane and either cools or warms the fluid in the inner ear. So when we heat up the fluid, okay, your fluid in your semicircular canal will move up. When we cool it, it will move down. How would you fake that? Okay, and what the reaction of the human eye is when we heat it or cool it and the fluid moves is what you see on the graph, nystagmus. Before we put the hot or cold air in the ear, this would be a flat, straight line. There's no way to fake it, and it repeats over and over and over and over. So again, peer-reviewed, this is not something that ever gets challenged. Okay, if a patient has nystagmus and they have dysfunction, or they don't have it and that's dysfunction, that is just pure objective information, and it is very meaningful. Okay, so someone who has a unilateral weakness, when the driver in a car bangs their head against the side window and they damage that inner ear mechanism, that left-sided inner ear, it will be a flat line here. They'll get no nystagmus, which they should when we make that fluid move. But the system is dead, okay? The connection to the brain is gone. Connections to the brain are very important, okay? Your brain is in charge of keeping you breathing, keeping your heart beating, and keeping you from falling. Your brain has to correlate all the information it gets from all the systems. If that left inner ear is damaged and gives no more information to the brain, your brain, when it gets confused with misinformation, when there's a lot of stimuli, will tense you up to protect you. That's a sympathetic nervous system reaction. But if I do this for the next 10 minutes while I talk to you, I'm going to get a headache, okay? And I'm going to have muscle spasm, okay? So there's a symptom that comes back when a patient tells you, oh, I have headaches, and then it's gone for a month. You think, oh, okay, it's gone. Because as soon as there's enough stimuli where the brain needs to be a little more worried about your balance, you get that sympathetic reaction and the headache comes back. So someone might not have a headache for 6 months, and then it comes back again just because they were in the mall. So again, this is why it's a permanent disability, why these people need constant care, constant rehab. They have to be reminded. And then when this does happen, then the therapist has to work with them again. Our recommendation used to be that patients go back into therapy for 8 weeks, twice a year, and do a round twice a year. But over the years, what we found was they're much better off to have 1 session a week for the rest of their lives. So that's what we recommend. And imagine the cost of $400, every week for a therapy session. And maybe they need both the PT and then separately cognitive therapy for the rest of their lives. If you're 20 years old, this is millions of dollars. Okay, so we're going to now move on a little bit here as we scroll. This is the nice picture that we show of physical therapy. It involves a lot of balance and coordination and vestibular movements and rehabilitation, which is training the brain that doesn't have certain information, how to use other information, okay? And we utilize the testing systems to reevaluate the patients and how they're doing. And the most recent decision that we got in Kentucky, okay, which goes along with Colorado and Rhode Island that we've done in the past. I work with a neurosurgeon in Kentucky, and they had actually a workers' comp case where they had a video. It was a bus driver. And the judge there, okay, Susan Kenny, I think it is, Judge Kenny, she wrote a 20-page dissertation basically on the idea that you can rely on posturography, and she wrote vestibulonystagmography. It's video nystagmography, but VNG, she wrote VNG, as reliable and credible, and you could use just that to help the clinician to diagnose concussion. The reason I mention that in that way is the actual testing, okay, is just that. It's objective information. It is then given to a clinician to finalize the clinical diagnosis. So concussion is not something that we do a test and say, it's a concussion. They have all the symptoms of a concussion, but we provide that to the physician in charge, or Dr. Newman will do an IME for you and make the final diagnosis of concussion. Okay. Here I have a little bit of a list that I like to have in front of me because there are certain times I forget to tell you, like the cost of the test, which is $10,000. And sometimes it's just it's always done on a lien, okay, unless your firm insists on paying us up front. And I kind of say that tongue in cheek, but I just got a call yesterday from an attorney who said, I will pay you by case cost. We have someone in Hawaii. So we'll pay your airfare, get the tech over there into the doctor's office and do the test. So I have a law firm in Schenectady who say, just please come to New York, we'll pay you up front. But short of that, it's all done on a lien, okay? And the lien is either a full invoice for a Medtrak for $10,000, or it's separated into $3,000 for whoever's doing the testing and $7,000 for our 30-page report. So that's up to the testing center. We have Medtrak Diagnostic testing centers, and they do them different ways. Another thing I want to talk about is causation, okay? And also how long after the injury can you do the test? So one question I get asked all the time is, can we do the test the next day? My advice is not to do that. We could, but the patient will have trouble concentrating. They've just been injured, not the best time, and you don't want that coming into challenge. I would wait a few days, okay? Let the injury calm down, let the person be able to concentrate and be able to cooperate in the test. But you could also do it a week later, a month later, a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, a decade later, a century later, okay? The injury is permanent, and it's going to show up in terms of this objective testing whenever we do the test. So if you get a case that's 2 or 3 years old, no problem. Causation, so what we would get challenges all the time is, oh, come on, this person was a football player in high school, they had concussions for sure, they must have had a concussion in the past. Or we say they had a concussion. First thing I would say is, well, how do you know that they had a concussion if they didn't lose consciousness? There was no diagnostic testing for that. Who said? A doctor said? One doctor says yes, one doctor says no. But I'll tell you what, we'll put that into evidence. We'll assume they did have one in the past. But, okay, Was the patient functioning? Was the patient working, going to school, running their family, running their business, participating in things, not seeking medical care, not looking for rehab, not looking for medications? The list goes on and on. So that past medical history makes the determination for you of causation. So typically what we see is that there's no history in this patient of seeking out care or medication or anything at all in their history, and they're functioning. Last deposition, was a teacher that teaches calculus, doing fine. Oh, they had a concussion. They had all those symptoms. No, they didn't. They were fine. They didn't have a previous concussion. And the past medical history bears that out. So almost all the cases, you will see that that will be the case for you. Who signs our reports? The main reports, the plan of care, are signed by Dr. Richard Newman, who's been a board-certified neurologist for 35 years, and myself. I'm a physical therapist for 34 years, and a rehabilitation specialist in this arena. So we'll sign the plan of care that gives you an immediate and a long-term care plan and all of the connections and correlations. You will also get separate raw data and narrative reports. So Dr. Richard Newman will sign the interpretation for the VNG, which I had mentioned earlier. He's done more than 100,000 of those for us, and we've done way more than that, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these. Then within all the raw data, you'll get another narrative report from Texas Medical Center for the neurocognitive test, and another one for me for the posturography test. So, and then at the end of those, all of that, which is usually about 26, 27 pages, then you'll get the 2-page future rehabilitation care cost report. And we did used to charge an additional $5,000 for that, but lucky you're in the age now where we just include that as part of our report because it was in such high demand. A lecture like this.